Our reading this morning is taken from Matthew chapter 15, reading verses 10 to 20. Then he called the crowd to him and said to them, "Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles." Then the disciples approached him and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?" He answered, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit." But Peter said to him, "Explain this parable to us." And then he said, "Are you still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile. Lord, may your word help feed our inner hunger and quench our thirsty souls.
Just leave it there for a second, Paul. Beauty. Fine. A list we can get into, eh? Oh, it's gone. Sorry, I was going to say leave it there for... But anyway, and the other thing I want to say is please wash your hands before you eat. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting conclusion. That's right, exactly. Look, I'm not going to stick too closely to the passage today, but I wanted to sit there. This was the passage for the week, and it kind of does fit with the whole sense of where I'm going today. Just keep that little thought in the back of your mind, like what's coming out of our mouths that's actually edifying, that's helpful, that's life-giving. Where are your intentions coming out? Where's your heart need to be moved into a good way? Because that's kind of underlying everything I'm about to say this morning. Okay, thanks, Kyle. You can go to the next slide. All right, buckle up. Here we go. Look, I learned pretty quickly in ministry. This is, as you've heard me say before, this is I think my 41st year of Christian ministry, full-time Christian ministry. And yeah, I started when I was 5. It's an old joke, I know. But look, I learned pretty quickly when I started conducting. I learned pretty quickly that the place where faith meets ex-faith, the place where I knew that was probably going to happen a lot of the time, was funerals. Now, I want to be very clear. I conducted a funeral this week, and this does not relate at all. Anything I'm about to say does not relate to the funeral this week, all right? But I learned pretty quickly that was the place. When I was asked to conduct a funeral, I'd get a phone call from a funeral director, and it would be kind of like along the lines of, "It's family who aren't from the church," or anything like that. "Can you come and conduct a funeral?" I ended up doing a lot of funerals like that, especially when I was up at Campbelltown. And I can't count the number of times people have politely and yet unapologetically let me know that they only got a minister for mum or dad's funeral because mum or dad had faith or religion, and they stated clearly that they wanted it for their ceremony, but the offspring themselves, who I was facing, had left the church and its antiquated beliefs and/or excluding beliefs and behaviours. I remember it came most strongly from one person in this statement about their parent. "It was their belief, but it's not mine." And I learned very early not to question why. I heard story after story from people why they or their family had rejected religion. In one family, I remember this family, it was one of the very early families one of the very first funerals that I ever conducted. And in one family, Dad, who had been a parish warden, so yes, it's not the Uniting Church, Dad had been a parish warden, had been rejected from having his ashes put in an interment spot in the church columbarium. You know what I'm talking about? Some churches have walls where they put them on site, and you can put your ashes in the columbarium. And the rector had said no. Rejected Dad, rejected him from having his ashes put in the wall of the church that he had served for decades. Because Dad hadn't been at church for a while. The poor guy got cancer and then got dementia and had no one to take him. His remains instead are out at Forest Lawn at Leppington. Another family let me know, and I think I might have told this story here once before, another family let me know how disappointed they were with the clergy of their affiliated denomination that they got to conduct their dad's funeral when he had died a few years before. And the clergyman took up half of the allotted time of their service lecturing everyone on the evils of smoking. I was conducting Mum's funeral, and I thought they were exaggerating. It's like some people ramp up the story, until someone, not from the family, came over afterwards to thank me for the service that I conducted for Mum and told me the exact same story of the clergy who had held them hostage with a morality lecture on smoking. I wish these were isolated stories, but they're not. I've heard these things over and over and over. And I think, as I've said before here too, Marketing 101 tells you that when you've had a bad experience of something, what do you do with it? You share it. Far and wide. Social media's been fantastic for that, hasn't it? Telling all your friends and family about the bad experiences you've had of someone's business or somebody as a person. Or imagine the stories that are going around about us. And I learned early on that my best posture, my best position, my best words that I could come up with at these times were to simply own the errors on the behalf of the collective. In other words, yes, I am part of the church, and yes, these things have happened. And simply say, sorry, it shouldn't have happened that way. I'm going to diverge for a second. Gal will be able to back this story up. I once was asked to speak at a wedding, to conduct a wedding, of two people getting married of the same sex. And my homily was an apology for how they'd been treated as two people for years and years and years. There were tears. There were tears from me. I finally looked up and there were people in tears. I've learnt to say sorry. And when it comes to these times, it comes to funerals, I've learnt to add to it, I can only promise you that this will be different. And thank you for trusting me. So many families, so many people have stories of hurt, pain, disillusionment with the church. I guess I want to stop for a moment and apologise if your background, if you've come to Australia more recently in your life, because I'm preaching from something that's historically Australian, and you may have had a different experience where you've come from. I hope you have. But here in Australia, there are so many people with stories about how religion and the church have not been able to accommodate their questions or their doubts. So many people feel judged for not coming up to scratch. The messiness or realities of life apparently have become too hard for God. Broken relationships, children born out of wedlock, addictions, job losses, poverty, having a child who was not opposite sex attracted, thinking a bit differently about God. All of these things have made the exclusion list, along with a lot more. There's a long list of misdemeanours, and there's a long list of people we've lost. We turned the faith into a morality test and decided to become judge and jury, while ignoring the fact that many churchgoers have been, or were, have been, maybe still are, of course not in our church, hiding things that if put under the spotlight would have brought shame and judgment on them too. It's much easier to deflect and point at somebody else and tell others how bad they are. So many people now have indifference and opposition to church, to the faith, to any faith, to God. And sadly, a lot of the reason and fault for that abandonment and opposition falls at our own feet. We're in census week, we're at the end of census week. Once every 5 years we get to fill out the questionnaire. And as you know and I know, Australians are abandoning religion as a label. And they have been for quite a while now. For all the rhetoric and for all the Christians postulating, you know what? We've never been a Christian nation. I've seen a lot of people trying to say online this week that let's get back to being a Christian nation, or let's, have you seen any of that? Have you heard people refer to us as a Christian nation? We're not. Our First Nations people were not Christian. Oh, no water today. Our First Nations people were not. Thanks, Brad. Our First Nations people were not Christian. The early settlers and colonialists were not particularly Christian. To give you a quick example, a group of convicts burnt down the first church. There's an obelisk up in Hunter Street in Sydney, and the spot where the church was. The convicts were so cranky. There's stories of John Marsden, the whipping parson. You'd be in his church on Sunday. You'd be in his courtroom on, because he was also the, not chief magistrate, whatever he was. You'd be in his church on Sunday. You'd be in his courtroom you'd be in his church on Sunday, in his courtroom on Monday, and you'd be whipped by him on Tuesday. The first chaplains that came out on the first sets of fleet, on the first boats, thank you, from the Church of England, basically came as the fun police. Christianity was a faith that was supposedly the faith of the first settlers. In 1824, Reverend James Denny, a Scottish Presbyterian minister, called New South Wales the most godless place under heaven. And whilst it's true Christianity was the faith of most, in their background, of most of the colonialists and settlers, of those who claimed faith, many brought their church-going habits with them for a while. But you see, religion was much more about affiliation. It was where you wanted to be seen in the end. It was where the place the educated people went. It was where you made social connections. It was a place for holding culture and for socialising, much more so than sharing the Christian faith in the growing colonies. Many of the clergy were despondent of the lack of the commitment of the people who attended. They came, but they lacked a kind of sense of purpose or direction or commitment in their faith. Trying to make the claim, one that many try, that, and in a way Christian wash our history, that Australia was and is a Christian nation is simply false. Whilst religious language was used to promote the cause of the Federation movement, here's another example of it, right? Neither Barton nor Deakin, who were the two people who were getting it going, who were the one, they lent into Christian language. And there was a saying that went around that God wants us to become a nation. So around Federation, God was sort of entered into as a way of backing up your cause. Of course, politicians never enter into religion for selfish interest, do they? So when our Constitution was written, and it was being drafted through the 1890s, paragraph 116 makes it clear that there is a separation of church and state. There were many struggles going on at this point for the church, where theology, science, and intellectualism were crossing fire, with the church trying to grapple for authority, for the authority it knew in England. And it mostly got stuck in a place of leaders offering polite observance and lip service, mixed in with this common and sometimes unspoken sense of the church's growing irrelevance. So if we go back 125 years when the first census was taken and most people had some sort of religious alignment, it was mostly not about faith, but about affiliation with where you'd come from. It wasn't about participation as much. I don't want to say there were no Christians, because there were, obviously, clearly. Good people of good faith, lots of faith. But there were a lot of people who were ticking a box because that's what their families had done, and that's kind of, if I needed to get a funeral, well, there was no such thing as a civil celebrant in those days. So if I needed to get buried or I wanted to get married or whatever, I needed to know someone who knew the local priest or minister. After 2 world wars and some prominent evangelical campaigns, Christianity did get a foothold in Australia. But even back then, back in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, when people speak of full churches and building bigger Sunday school halls, when it felt like everyone was Christian, only at most 30% of Australians went to church. At most, with any sense of regularity. And since that time, since the 40s and 50s, Christianity in Australia has been on the decline. Anti-theism, anti-God, has gained a lot of traction. There's a deeper disillusionment with abuses of power by the church and its agents. Generations of people have grown up not knowing church as part of their cultural or historical affiliation. people of other faiths have come to our shores. And the church, in response, in many cases, has dug in deeper on poor theology, poor and outdated theology, around things like origins of life. How did we get here? Around things like sex and sexuality, around family, around human-led climate change, around gender roles, and much more. We've dug in deeper to things that don't make sense. Instead of embracing science and openly sharing in the parts that are mystery, because scientists will tell you there's mystery. And rather than talking from that space and sharing in that space, we've made it a false enemy of our key faith text, the Bible. I paraphrase an Australian author and demographer, Bernard Salt, when he wrote this, Australia has abandoned the concept and practice of God and replaced it with consumerism and hedonism. And I would add sport. I've got to confess, I make offerings to that God a bit, so... So I want to stop for a moment. I want to make this point. At no point did Jesus ever say that his hope was for world domination. And if you quote Matthew 28 at me, I'm going to tell you you're reading it wrong. Jesus didn't say we should go out and baptise all the nations and turn them into Christians. What he did say was go out to everywhere with this message. And where people choose this way, baptise them. At no point did Jesus ever foresee or commission his followers to Christianise the whole world. We have to own it, that when Christianity holds power, it often abuses it, like any other power force in our world. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, Christians in power often do a poor job of it. Not all the time. Again, I don't want to say everyone, because there are some really good people of faith in leadership. But when we start making it that everyone has to be Christian, man, the mess we get into. I think Jesus knew that his movement would only make sense to some. He knew that many would reject it. He knew it held the meaning and key to life, but many would either water it down or make it fit for purpose for themselves, leaving out the hard parts. I don't want this to sound like despair or hopelessness. I don't want to get stuck trying to work out who to blame. If anything, I want to be clear that what I think around us, all around us, is opportunity. We have this amazing opportunity to be a disrupting surprise in people's lives. Because what they're expecting of us, I hope, is far different from what they get. We get this chance to distance ourselves from that which is damaging and to see and to meet people. Not statistics, not problems, not as enemies who have rejected us, but we're in this really open field where we get this chance to share this message of love and to live it out and to help make it make sense in people's lives. I'm going to finish up here in a moment, but I just want to go back to as the church, we need to always, I believe, we need to always hold this particular tension, that we are not at the centre, and we need to stop thinking that we ever were in the centre. And we need to think that we own the centre and that our voice should be the central voice that people come to. Instead, I believe we should let our actions speak louder than our words. That our faith lived out in ways, and I am just going to very quickly address the passage and just say, rather than seeing as a list of things we shouldn't do, let's let the good intentions of our heart come out in ways that lead us to love our neighbour, to see our neighbour and to love our neighbour. And look, I don't know what the census is going to bring, all right, what this latest census is going to bring. And I don't know how it's going to be used, how that information is going to be used when it comes to religion. But what I do know is this, is that, and I don't know about you, but I know about me, there's nowhere else for me to turn. These are the words of life. The words of Jesus, the way of Jesus is the way of life. I'd like to think that works not just in this space or in other spaces like ours. I'd like to think the way of Jesus offers life to all. That's where my faith is. I'd like to think that's where your faith is, or somewhere in that kind of space. Again, I don't know what it will all mean. And we'll find out when the results start coming out. But there are loud voices circling, telling us what it should mean for us, that we're irrelevant, defunct, stupid for being theists. And my hope is that we will return that with love. Not with poor religion, but with love. And I'm hoping you'll continue to join me in that. If you have